Shock hit the timeline, not just because someone died, but because grief itself became a target, and Kristin Chenoweth found herself in the crosshairs the moment she mourned a man many of her fans considered indefensible. She hit post, a simple note of sadness for a life cut short, and the internet moved like a storm front, fast and punishing. If you want the full picture as it unfolds, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. You'll get the first updates the second they break. Chenoweth's confession came later, after the outrage crested, when the comments and quote tweets had done their work. She said the backlash nearly broke her, a stark sentence from a Broadway powerhouse who's weathered brutal schedules, relentless scrutiny, and decades in a business that can grind people down. In her telling, the wound wasn't just the volume of criticism, it was the assumption about her motives. People decided her empathy was an endorsement, her sorrow a political statement, her faith a betrayal of the community she has long stood beside. That kind of narrative gets sticky online. It clings to you even after you explain. And she did explain, carefully, repeatedly, saying she had a human moment, that she was grieving a person's death, not signing up for his worldview. The emotional toll is believable, not just because she said it, but because anyone who has misstepped in public, even in a tiny way, knows how shame multiplies when strangers point and shout. People magazine captured that vulnerability plainly, noting how she described the experience and her choice to step back from litigating it in public. What set the stage for the firestorm is the same fact that ripped across headlines in September, when Charlie Kirk, the conservative activist and founder of Turning Point USA, was shot and killed during a public event at Utah Valley University. That single sentence carries incredible weight. A public figure, polarizing and loud, taken by a political assassination, in a moment when American temperature is already boiling. Newsrooms scrambled, live blogs spun up, and a countryside, some in grief, some in fury, many in fear of what it signals about where discourse ends and violence begins. Major outlets confirmed the killing and traced the manhunt and arrest that followed, painting a timeline that moved from chaos to custody. It is grim and it is real, and it contextualizes why any public reaction, especially from another famous person, was going to be judged with binoculars. In the hours after his death, Chenoweth did what a lot of humans do. She went to Instagram, where digital condolences often stand in for the casseroles people used to deliver. She wrote that she didn't always agree with Kirk, but she appreciated some of his perspectives, and that she was heartbroken. That last word, heartbroken, is easy to say and hard to wear when your audience expects a line in the sand. Screenshots captured the sentiment, aggregators amplified it, and suddenly the comment lived far beyond her feed, stripped of tone and context, held up as evidence in a culture war trial where the verdict is crowdsourced. The mechanics are familiar, but every time it happens, it still feels like watching a match hit dry brush. The criticism focused on a single tension, Kirk's record on LGBTQ+ issues versus Chenoweth's history as an ally. For many, mourning Kirk felt like crossing a bright line, even if the words never endorsed his politics. Some argued that grief humanizes those whose policies dehumanize, that it softens the public memory in ways that don't serve the marginalized. Others pointed out that compassion in the face of death is a moral reflex, not a political endorsement, and that refusing to mourn is a different kind of hardening. If that sounds messy, well, it is. Online spaces rarely make room for grief that doesn't fit the template, and people tend to collapse nuanced positions into yes or no, friend or foe. The context matters here. Kirk's rhetoric was widely criticized as harmful to LGBTQ+ people, and those wounds are not academic, they're lived experience for many of Chenoweth's fans. That's why the reaction was so sharp, so quick, so unforgiving. For Chenoweth, the blowback cut deep because it collided with identity, work, and witness. She has built a public self that merges glittering show tunes with open, sometimes risky allyship, while also carrying a vocal Christian faith. People often try to position those things as opposites, faith versus queer advocacy, church versus Broadway, but she's long insisted they can live in the same house. In her latest reflections, she doubled down on that idea, saying she never meant harm, that she was simply grieving a life, and that her guiding principle remains love. It's a simple sentence, maybe even too simple for some, but her point is that empathy is part of her practice, even when it's difficult. She didn't hide from the hurt, either. Nearly broke me, she said again, And I think that phrase lands because it admits fragility without claiming martyrdom. It leaves room for growth and maybe apology by action rather than by press release. The timeline around Kirk's death carries its own gravity, and it explains why emotions were running like live wire. News outlets documented a public memorial, law enforcement updates, and the arrest of a 22-year-old suspect. The case has already touched debates about political violence, campus security, speech, and the line between protest and threat. There are vigils and countervigils, tributes and denunciations, a swirl of statements from politicians, student groups, and advocacy organizations. The country looks at a white tent shot through the lens of a phone and sees whatever it's primed to see, which is precisely why reactions to reactions, like Chenoweth's, become their own discourse. They are proxies for bigger fights. They are tests of how we sort our grief when we don't like the dead. Here's the hardest part, and I'm not entirely sure there's a clean answer. When a public figure dies, especially one whose politics you believe harmed people, what does ethical mourning look like, if it exists at all? Some say you keep quiet, you don't add to the noise, you let families and friends carry the sorrow while you hold on to your moral clarity. Others argue you can acknowledge the humanity without sanitizing the legacy, that you can say, a life ended, and we still reject the harm it caused. Chenoweth attempted the latter in a few lines, and the internet read it as the former. Maybe she could have used different words. Maybe nothing would have helped. That's the thing about moments like this, intention and reception don't always meet in the middle. Her insistence that faith and advocacy can coexist is not new, but it is timely. In the days after Kirk's killing, tributes from conservatives landed next to reminders of his statements that many LGBTQ+ people found dangerous, and that juxtaposition made social media feel like a room where two sound systems blasted different songs. Chenoweth's voice tried to be a harmony, however imperfect. She said love, understanding, listening, and patience still matter, even here, even now. In practice, that might look like showing up for queer causes with the same intensity she always has, while refusing to treat death as a sport. It might also look like absorbing some unfair blows, because that's what happens when people are already hurting and you step into the middle of their pain. The legal case will march on, and new details will surface. Already, coverage has tracked the suspect's court appearances and the procedural decisions that come with high-profile trials. None of that resolves the moral questions, but it reminds us that the story is larger than one post and one pylon. There is a family without a husband and father, a campus community processing trauma, and a political ecosystem recalibrating around a loss. There are also queer kids who heard the dead man's words in life and felt smaller because of them. Holding all of that at once takes more than a caption. It takes attention, nuance, and time, which are three things the internet rarely gives. So what did Chenoweth learn? She said resilience, compassion, and the cost of empathy in a polarized world. That sounds like a press-friendly triad, sure, but in her voice it reads like someone who put her hand on a hot stove and remembers the heat. The next time a public figure dies and timelines demand instant takes, maybe she will choose silence, or maybe she will write a fuller reflection that leaves less room for projection. Maybe, like so many of us, she will hesitate, erase, retype, and finally speak with the trembling that comes from knowing any sentence can be misread. In my experience, that trembling is not cowardice, it is care. Here's the quiet truth humming under all of this: compassion is not a contract. It does not obligate you to rewrite a person's record, it does not require you to lift their ideas, and it does not excuse harm. It simply refuses to pretend that death is a score. When public empathy clashes with political expectation, the backlash can be brutal, and the pain can feel personal, especially when your life's work ties you to the people most wounded by the subject of your empathy. Chenoweth stood there, got knocked down, and, by her account, got back up. You don't have to agree with everything she said to notice that getting up still matters. And if we're honest, most of us have posted something from the gut and paid for it later. The scale is different, the lesson is the same. If you want more reporting like this, with the full context and none of the performative shouting, make sure you're subscribed and your notifications are on. Stories change quickly, especially in cases this raw, and we'll keep separating fact from fireworks as the details evolve. In the end, this saga leaves a hard question hovering over all of us who live online. When someone you oppose dies, how do you love the living without lying about the dead? I think the answer is narrow and uncomfortable, a ridge path rather than a highway, but if we care about the world we're building, it's worth trying to walk it.